Hi, my name is Michael, and I'm going to be spoiling everything in Seasons 1 and 2 of 13 Reasons Why, so this is your warning for that. 13 Reasons Why is one of the most controversial TV shows of the past decade. As soon as it came out a year ago, in spring of 2017 on Netflix, it really just generated this firestorm of people wanting to talk about it and explain what they felt was wrong with it and all of the issues with the show, and there were a fair bit. Mainly because the show tackles one of the most difficult subject matters you could tackle in any program, which is suicide. And especially one involving a teenager, that just is guaranteed to cause people to get upset and get interested in this. The series follows Hannah Baker, a young teenage girl who kills herself after a series of terrible events in her life, and she leaves a set of tapes to be distributed after her death to the people that she felt contributed in some way to her decision to take her own life. And the first season I thought was pretty interesting. There were a lot of criticisms, some of them valid, some of them less so, of the program. But overall, I felt it was an interesting journey, kind of a mystery that you could take into figuring out what this girl's life was like. It followed Clay Jensen, a young man who was sort of a nerd, kind of an outsider, socially awkward, who was in love with Hannah and never really was able to pursue a relationship with her before her death, and his obsession with her throughout the seasons is interesting to follow. And he's sort of the moral guide and compass throughout the show. I'm going to be leaving a link to the review I did of the first season if you want to check that out before this one. The second season, I felt, was not really nearly as good as the first. And the first definitely had an air of mystery to it. You know, you were wondering what the heck was going on and why she took her life, and trying to figure that out was a very complicated process, and every episode was one more clue to figuring out why that was happening. Whereas the second season, everyone already knows what happened or what was on the tapes, so we continue to learn a little bit about Hannah, but it feels that all of the salient features of her life were already discussed, and there were a couple of new things they added which felt sort of weird because this was originally based on a book written about 10 years ago or more. And so the second season is definitely continuing things beyond the scope of the book, which is always a curious process because the writer obviously felt that the story should have ended really at the end of season 1. So they're trying to invent a lot of new stuff that wasn't originally in the story. So that's a very peculiar process. And most of the second season follows Hannah Baker's trial, or rather the trial that her parents have started, accusing her high school of creating a harmful atmosphere that led to her death, and they're trying to get some recognition of that. And all of the people that were originally on the tapes, the original causes that Hannah felt led to her death, have to go up on the stand and explain themselves. And partially it feels like it's a strange sensation that it simultaneously feels like material that's already been covered, and yet when they talk about new stuff, the new stuff is very uncomfortable and strange. Like it's an irrelevant feature that obviously wasn't in the original season because, well, it wasn't important, or it was bizarrely left out of the first season, like they uncomfortably invented some stuff that supposedly happened to her that wasn't really there. And it's kind of hard to watch this, especially because I don't particularly care about the trial. I don't really think that Hannah, though she suffered terribly, I don't think the school was really at fault, and so I don't really have any investment in the trial. I mean, maybe the school could have acted better, but I don't know if like a wrongful death suit or whatever it is they're filing is really appropriate here, so I can't really get invested in a huge part of the second season. They continue to follow all of the characters, and I really did enjoy most of the characters in the previous seasons. I think they were interesting enough to follow. I like getting into this world and seeing their thoughts and feelings on things and what they're going through. Clay is kind of expanded upon a little bit when he finds out that Hannah bizarrely and absurdly had a romantic relationship, a sexual relationship with another kid at school that they never mentioned in the previous season, which really feels like it should have been. It's peculiar that it's not there. And he sort of is thinking, realizing that she's a little bit more of a complicated person. We also get an interesting moment where we find out that Hannah was at one point a bully when she was in middle school. And we hear in the first season that there was some sort of incident at her old school before she transferred, and it's implied heavily that she was bullied, but in fact she was bullying another student. So I think that was an interesting way to make her a little bit less of a sympathetic victim here and show that she was a complicated human being just like everyone else is. The first season ended with a number of cliffhangers, not the least of which was someone tried to kill themselves, and we find out in this one that it was actually Alex who tried to kill himself, and we see his recovery process after he shot himself. He's handicapped now and has to use a cane, and he's sort of struggling with all of the thoughts and feelings and emotions that he went through, although even though some of this was pretty good, it felt kind of irritating because it was a little bit soap opera-ish, because he lost his memory and he was trying to recover it. That felt exactly like something from the days of our lives, not from a well-written television drama that we're supposed to take seriously. We also get a look into Zach Dempsey's life, this character that was, he wasn't peripheral, but he was much less explored in the original series and just seemed kind of like a jock jerk. But in this one, he's having a major crisis of conscience, and he's actually moving himself out of that sexually exploitative athletic world that he was living in before and is embracing being a good person and helping other people. We also get to see Jess's story, the person who was sexually assaulted by Bryce in the first season, and her continuing journey to live a normal life after that, and whether she's willing to come forward and go to the police about it, which thankfully she eventually does. One of the most interesting things that was promised in this season was that we get to see Hannah's mother and what she's going through, and we get a lot more of her feelings and her attitudes towards things. And I think that's absolutely great, because that was something that was only hinted at in the first season, and we get much, much more of it here, and it's really good, and I like that quite a bit. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things in the show to criticize as being exploitative or having, at the very least, let's say, as neutral as possible, a questionable attitude towards the variety of very serious subjects that they bring up. Normally, I wouldn't bring up a politicization of a show, but the show's marketing especially is politicizing itself, and even within the show, especially in this season, they get into more heavily political matters, and it becomes much less a story about one girl and about the entire world. And I think that is really to the show's detriment, especially because there are, as I said, many questionable attitudes towards mental health, suicide, rape, a lot of other things there, that it's very, very hard to watch. The show really ramps up the melodrama in this season because there's a lot of ridiculous moments. The first season wasn't really realistic at all, but it was far more realistic than this one, where there's a gigantic brawl where all the good and bad guys are beating each other up in the hallway. The guidance counselor character, Mr. Porter, assaults Bryce at one point. He just grabs him in the bathroom, and he actually takes time out of his day after school to go to parents' houses and talk to them. And I kind of liked Mr. Porter's character in this one because he recognizes that he made a mistake in the previous season in his dealings with Hannah, but it doesn't feel very realistic. Like, his severe pain about all this feels a little bit off. It doesn't feel like something an actual person would do in this situation. There were other little instances that just kind of don't make sense, like Clay actually breaks into a hospital and goes to somebody's room a couple of times, and that's like a minor little logistical point, but you can't do that, it just doesn't smack of realism. You can't sneak into a hospital. Those places are guarded and the doors are all sealed, and there's police officers and security guards there all the time. You can't just sneak into his girlfriend's room at one point. That just doesn't make sense. And there's another one where they actually leave town for one day and drive to San Francisco to get one of their friends who's a homeless kid now, and it's like these children have just left town and gone to the big city and wander around for a day and find this guy. That just feels so unrealistic. Probably the most interesting thing that they teased at the end of the first season was with Tyler, this kid who's also awkward and weird and doesn't really get along socially very well, sort of like Clay, but he's a little bit more damaged and peculiar than Clay is and a lot less sympathetic. And at the end of the first season, they actually teased that he might be getting involved in a school shooting, which is pretty shocking. And I'm actually surprised and kind of, pleasantly surprised that they took this much more sympathetic view, I think, of one of the most hated groups of people in the entire country right now, the sort of loner school shooter type person who's just utterly execrated and despised by most people, and there's virtually no sympathy for them. But this show actually has empathy for these people and shows that, the process that they go through can be stopped along the way, but it's just a series of terrible events that lead a damaged person there's probably something already wrong with them to eventually take this horrible, horrible path. And I remember in one of Jello Biafra from the Dead Kennedys punk band, one of his spoken word albums just after the Columbine massacre, he said, "I'm trying to figure out what's going on because when I was in high school, it sucked, but I formed this own little group of our weirdo mutant kids, and we just sort of found solace in one another, socializing, and that's how we made it through, whereas these guys were not." And we kind of get to see that. We get to see Tyler throughout the season sort of going down a very different path and learning to socialize with people, maybe start having fun with a girl, maybe, making a friend that he can express himself with and live a life with and leave these dark, violent thoughts behind. Of course, by the end of the season, he ends up on his road back to committing a school shooting again because everything kind of falls apart. But it's really interesting that they empathize with these kind of characters instead of just loathing and hating them like we're sort of trained to by the media. And this one takes a much more sophisticated view that maybe we should sympathize with everyone, try to help everyone, and everyone can be helped. So I thought that was nice. Although, at the end, I found the last episode to be really exploitative and horrible because, remember I said there was going to be spoilers. At the end of it, we get to see Tyler actually is raped himself by one of the jock asshole guys. And it's as difficult, at least, to watch as what happened to Jess and Hannah in the first season. It is horrifying. And it really just felt cruel and dark and evil. And the fact that they ended it with a narrow averting of his school shooting also felt really, really exploitative that this was happening. And the fact that we have to wait a year if they're going to make another season to find this out is... I really don't like that. I think that's just kind of crass and unpleasant that they're using such a serious issue just to sell, to market a television show. This is a much more serious issue. This isn't like Who Shot JR. This is a deadly issue in America right now. And the fact that they're just sort of exploiting it is very dark and cruel, and I just don't like it. Overall, I think the second season had some good points in it where they expanded on various characters, and I did enjoy that, and Hannah felt sort of weirdly, unnecessarily a part of this season because she's been dead for around 5 to 6 months now. And she shows up in every single episode, but she shows up in kind of a ridiculous way because in the first season, Clay would occasionally see Hannah after her death, and it was supposed to be sort of a metaphor for him thinking about her as he was, listening to the tapes. It made sense as a metaphor for the show. But here, it's not so much a metaphor, and it actually seems to have crossed over to Clay having some sort of schizophrenic delusion, because he's actually talking to Hannah. It's like he's chatting with her ghost now. She's like Hannah the suicidal ghost girl or something. It's kind of crazy and ridiculous. It seems absurd that he's talking to her, or rather talking to himself, but sort of pretending to talk to her rather than having what seems to be a very serious mental breakdown. Finding out where these various characters went with their journey is interesting, I suppose, but this is far less than the first season was, and I really, really worry if they're going to continue this in the third season. I really don't want them to have a third season of the show. I think the first season was enough, and continually exploiting these issues after Hannah's death. 13 Reasons Why doesn't even make sense anymore. That's going to be irrelevant in the next season if they have another one. It's just going to be... It really ends up feeling like After School Special, the TV show, at the end of this, like an episodic series that you're going to watch in health class when you're in high school. It's just so... It really didn't work as well. It's not as bad as people say it is, I think, and is not as terrible as they want to make it out to be, because I think that there should be more shows like this. I think it is this way and does these things with the clumsiness that it appears to, because we just haven't had many of these shows. If you were making the first police show ever made, of course it's going to be terrible, and we very rarely have shows that explicitly cover these issues, these serious issues in depth like this. And so we're going to get it wrong and wrong and wrong and wrong, and eventually we're going to get it right. And I think the first season did a lot of things right and was very interesting, and a lot of things wrong, and that was very unfortunate. But I think shows like this can gradually lead us towards artistically making programs like this better and better, and we can learn how to tell them with a greater sophistication than this show has. So, yeah, tell me what you think of the show in the comments. I want to know if you hated it, if you felt that the criticisms I've made of it are valid, or the criticisms other people have made of their portrayal of the various issues are valid, or whether you think they did a good job at that. I think they did good things and bad things, and this is just a stepping stone towards making a really television show about these subjects, and we just need to work through the kinks in that process and eventually get there. Please like this video if you liked it. Please subscribe if you want to see more of my videos. I'm going to be making them about television shows, Netflix shows, movies, video games, all kinds of subjects. My name is Michael, and thank you very much, and have a good night.